I thought he saved me, until I found the photograph hidden inside his gift. For 3 weeks, Zoe believed Giorgio was her protector. He brought her coffee exactly how she liked it. He kissed her forehead like she mattered. He made her sleep without the hallway light, for the first time in 10 years. Then a photograph fell from the rare book he gave her. Zoe at 16, smiling at graduation, and Giorgio in the background, watching. This was never fate. It was a debt. The subject is Lena. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? The subject was attempting a simple delivery of an 18th century manuscript to a luxury hotel, expecting a quiet coffee afterward. Instead, she encounters her abusive former partner. In a state of acute hyperarousal, she retreats into an elevator, essentially a steel cage, and begs a stranger for help. The stranger is Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist. He does not merely assist her. He immediately asserts physical dominance, gripping her waist with the practiced calm of an apex predator. He looks at her ex-partner with the cold calculation of a man assigning a burial plot. This is the precise moment the psychological trap snaps shut. The former partner retreats instantly, recognizing a superior predator. The subject emits a nervous laugh, a standard tension release, but Vittorio remains perfectly still. As the doors close, his grip on her waist does not loosen. When hotel staff later address him with absolute terror, the reality crystallizes in her mind. She has traded a domestic abuser for a highly organized, lethal captor. In her fragmented recollection, she dissociates, speaking to an imagined audience as Lena. We see her regress to the morning origin. A bakery opening at 6:30, where she deliberately arrives at 6:32. We often cling to tiny illusions of control when our broader reality is entirely dictated by fear. The subject anchors her fragile mental state to mundane rituals. The clerk in the gray apron, the exact scent of the morning bread, the immediate availability of her coffee. These are the environmental stabilizers she uses to ward off complete psychological collapse. She continuously adjusts a broken pair of glasses, an artifact from a past trauma during a harsh winter in Philadelphia. She rationalizes not replacing them, convincing herself that a crooked frame serves as a psychological warning to others, that her life is equally damaged. This internalized devaluation is critical to observe. When the victim already believes they are fundamentally broken, they offer virtually no resistance. When a predator decides to claim them entirely, she describes her living conditions with a notable cognitive dissonance. A tiny, unheated apartment on the 4th floor, intrusive neighbors playing the piano, windows that fail to block the cold. Yet, she classifies this miserable isolation as the most discreet palace in the world. This is a preliminary form of Stockholm Syndrome, romanticizing her own deprivation, because it offers the illusion of safety. No one knew her address. Her isolation was absolute. She proceeds across the city, arriving at the rare book dealer at 7:45. She encounters her employer, Madame Aureli, a woman who demands constant vigilance. Lena has engineered a life devoid of human connection, replacing emotional security with predictability. Her employer, an intimidating figure with short white hair, functions as another dominant force in the life of the subject. The woman addresses her as Zoe, indicating the use of an alias to further sever ties with her past trauma. The employer proposes a task, openly mocking her dignity in the process. Lena responds with defensive self-deprecation, confirming her self-worth was abandoned when she fled Philadelphia for a rotting attic. The assignment is a manual delivery of an 18th century manuscript to an affluent buyer at the Plaza Hotel. We observe an immediate physiological fear response in the subject. She takes a sharp breath. The mere mention of a high-status environment triggers profound social anxiety. The anxiety escalates into a state of mild panic. The subject perceives the 5-star hotel as an impenetrable fortress, a place with doors physically too heavy for a woman living in poverty. Yet, a fragile pride overrides her survival instincts. She fabricates competence, assuring her employer she can handle the task before lunch. The employer offers cab fare and issues a chillingly accurate warning, telling her to eat because a luxury hotel consumes the hungry. Lena recognizes the passive-aggressive nature of this advice, comparing it to tea laced with needles. She then compartmentalizes her fear by focusing on the physical object. The manuscript is secured in a dark velvet folder with cotton gloves. She clings to the illusion of order. We must pay close attention to her obsessive preparation here. She organizes the documents with meticulous precision, a classic behavioral adaptation. She operates under the tragic delusion that controlling her immediate physical environment will neutralize the massive external chaos threatening her life. It is only in the enforced stillness of the taxi that her repressed trauma surfaces. The intrusive thoughts of Bastien, her former French fiancé, flood her consciousness. He is the specific catalyst for her flight response, the reason she crossed an ocean 2 years ago. He is the son of an influential lawyer, a man conditioned by wealth, an unyielding power to believe that his desires are absolute and his actions carry zero consequences. The clinical profile of Bastien is painfully standard for a domestic abuser. He used public humiliation as a tool for subjugation, listing her perceived flaws during family dinners. He executed a systematic isolation protocol, monitoring her phone, dictating her wardrobe, entirely dismantling her social support network. When she severed the bond, his response was a dismissive laugh, an assertion of inevitable ownership. She slept for 10 years with a hallway light on, conflating the fear of her abuser with the lingering grief of her deceased father. The taxi arrives at the pale stone facade of the plaza. She adjusts her broken glasses, uses the velvet folder as a physical shield, takes a deep breath, and steps directly into the trap. She experiences the hotel lobby not as a place of luxury, but as an acoustically hostile environment. The marble floors echo the sound of her heels, amplifying her paranoia, making her feel aggressively visible. She notes the heavy chandeliers. She notes the chandeliers and the pervasive scent of jasmine and wealth. She approaches at the front desk, attempting to execute her simple professional duty. But as the receptionist instructs her to wait, the environment shatters. She registers an auditory trigger before anything else, a specific, deep laugh echoing from the restaurant corridor. It is the sound of Bastien. Her abuser is physically present, moving casually through the lobby. The statistical improbability of this encounter instantly overwhelms her nervous system. Come with me. We are about to observe a total physiological freeze response. The subject watches Bastien, noting his relaxed posture, a terrifying contrast to the absolute panic detonating inside her own mind. The physical space of the lobby begins to compress. He is merely 20 meters away. A shift of 5 degrees in his line of sight will expose her. She desires nothing more than to merge with the architecture, praying the wooden counter will physically swallow her. She ceases to breathe. This is not a metaphor. It is the literal, paralyzing apnea experienced only by prey that knows the predator is within striking distance. The receptionist continues speaking, but the words are entirely lost to the roaring alarm bells in her brain. Her cognitive functions completely abandon verbal processing and shift entirely to spatial survival mapping. She scans for service stairs, kitchen doors, any architectural blind spot. She identifies a short corridor housing 3 mirrored elevators as the most efficient vector for escape. Remarkable, really, how trauma trains the human mind to calculate threat angles in milliseconds. She offers a hollow word of thanks to the receptionist and moves. She suppresses the overwhelming urge to sprint, knowing instinctively that sudden motion triggers a predator pursuit reflex. She enters the furthest elevator, striking the 5th floor button with erratic desperation, and turns to face the closing mechanism. Clutching the manuscript like body armor, the auditory hallucination of the threat amplifies. The laugh of Bastien pierces the space again, significantly closer now. She begins a silent, frantic negotiation with the elevator door, pleading with a higher power to simply shut the metal panels. She notes the excruciatingly slow movement of the luxury doors, a delay that feels almost malevolent. It is only in this suspended state of terror that her peripheral vision registers a massive anomaly. A dark figure dominates the reflective glass behind her. A tall man in a dark suit, whom she had entirely failed to notice because her threat detection systems were singularly locked on to Bastian. Her paralysis doubles. The known threat is outside, but a completely unknown variable is locked inside with her. She processes the stranger in clinical fragments, the severe angle of a jawline, the heavy, expensive watch. But mostly, she processes the chilling absolute silence he commands within the confined space. The doors remain open. Her higher reasoning shuts down entirely, yielding to raw, primal instinct. A victim who has spent 10 years sleeping with the lights on cannot afford the luxury of rational deliberation. Her nervous system executes a desperate, improvised protocol. She decides to use the stranger as a human shield, aiming to create a public deflection before Bastian can inflict a private atrocity. She violently steps backward, colliding with the solid frame of the stranger, dropping her cargo, and begging for salvation in a fractured whisper. Let us open this clinical file together. We begin with a trauma-induced panic response. The subject, Zoe, initiates contact in a desperate flight maneuver to evade a secondary predator, Bastian. She collides with Giorgio, a man presenting an impenetrable physical boundary. In severe distress, she executes a remarkably flawed kiss against his jaw, just as the elevator doors part. Here is where the behavioral anomaly occurs. Instead of rejecting the intrusion, the megalomaniacal narcissist asserts immediate territorial dominance. His massive hand anchors upon her waist. Even drowning in her own neurochemical fear, she registers an unsettling certainty in his absolute, uninvited possession. Observe how seamlessly the narcissist constructs the illusion of intimacy. Giorgio slides his other arm behind her shoulders, lowering his chin to her temple with the practiced muscle memory of a long-term paramour. Then, he deploys his auditory control. He speaks in a soft, fluid Italian that she does not consciously comprehend, though her amygdala instantly translates the tonal threat. It is the chilling resonance of an apex predator, a man accustomed to authorizing executions before morning coffee. In the corridor, the secondary threat, Bastian, halts entirely. His gaze flickers over Zoe, with initial surprise, swiftly transitioning into a cold calculation, as he processes the apex entity standing deliberately behind her. You and I can easily read the subtle biomechanics of intimidation playing out here. The tension in Bastian's shoulders abruptly shifts, betraying his sudden awareness that he has wandered into a higher jurisdiction of violence, so to speak. He exhibits a textbook submission reflex, stepping backward, raising his hands in a hollow social surrender and masking his retreat with an artificial smile. As he withdraws and the metal doors seal them in, the victim is left entirely paralyzed. She remains physically anchored against a complete stranger, her resting heart rate exploding against her ribs in a frantic rhythm. For several agonizing seconds, a suffocating silence descends, heavy with the clinical olfactory notes of premium leather and sandalwood. At this juncture, the subject's nervous system predictably overloads, manifesting as hysterical, involuntary laughter. She babbles across multiple languages, attempting to rationalize her erratic behavior and project the image of a highly dysfunctional civilian. She emits two sharp, high-pitched vocalizations, the precise frequency a human body produces, to stave off a psychological collapse. When she attempts to physically disengage, she hits a structural wall. The megalomaniac does not release her. He exerts no brutal force, which is infinitely more terrifying. It is the chilling, unyielding stillness of a captor who has unilaterally decided that his new acquisition will remain exactly where he placed her, entirely oblivious to her autonomy. The hysterical breakdown ceases as cognitive processing resumes, prompting her to finally evaluate her captor. She catalogs his physical markers with hyper-vigilant precision. He is a male in his mid-30s, bearing a microscopic scar indicative of past physical trauma, eyes devoid of emotional warmth, and a completely rigid facial affect. His attire denotes severe socioeconomic dominance, a bespoke dark suit and meticulously embroidered family crest upon his cuff, visible only because his hand remains an iron shackle upon her waist. This subtle insignia serves as a subconscious branding. Then, he initiates his verbal interrogation in her native tongue, inquiring about her identity with a soft, practiced accent devoid of human empathy. She supplies her primary identifier, Zoe, managing remarkably steady vocal tone. When he silently demands a surname, she exhibits a minor rebellion by withholding it. In a display of supreme narcissistic control, he tilts his head, a micro-expression masquerading as respect, but operating as pure, calculated assessment. He removes his hand with agonizing slowness, a deliberate psychological tactic to reinforce that her physical release is entirely at his discretion, not hers. The elevator breaches the 5th floor, revealing a fortified perimeter. Another operative stands guard, bearing the identical embroidered crest, a secondary reinforcement of his tribal authority. Immediately behind this enforcer, the highly elevated baseline of the hotel manager enters the scene. Let us analyze the environmental response to the megalomaniac's presence, as it accelerates the victim's psychological conditioning. The manager experiences immediate vascular constriction. The blood literally drains from his face upon visual confirmation of the apex predator. He babbles frantic apologies, his hands frozen mid-air in abject terror, uttering the title, Don Castellaneta. Simultaneously, a service worker aborts his trajectory entirely, fleeing the corridor as if escaping a lethal contagion. A nearby receptionist initiates a silent, panic-stricken security protocol. The sheer, unadulterated dread radiating from the civilian population solidifies the absolute reality of her captor's lethal capacity and cements her impending trauma bond. At this moment, the subject experiences a catastrophic cognitive collision. While detached from global syndicates, her academic background in archival history forces a violent synthesis of the data points. The name Castellaneta, the geographical anchor of Sicily, the archaic title of Dawn, they merge into an undeniable, terrifying profile of organized lethality. The velvet folder of manuscripts resting at their feet suddenly represents a jarring absurdity against the immediate threat to her biological survival. She attempts a feeble verbal withdrawal, a regressive whisper stating she must leave. Meanwhile, the subordinate operative meticulously gathers her fallen documents with deeply incongruous care. She registers this gentle precision, entirely failing to comprehend the violent sociopathy it masks. Notice how the megalomaniac entirely invalidates her attempt to withdraw by refusing to acknowledge her auditory input. Instead, he issues sweeping environmental commands to his captive audience, restructuring the spatial dynamic to suit his immediate needs. He demands private dining isolation and the immediate evacuation of adjacent territories, projecting absolute operational control. He then reclaims her property, ordering his subordinate, Vincenzo, to take possession of the velvet folder. Vincenzo complies with the emotionless efficiency of a veteran enforcer who has processed decades of atrocities without a single psychological fracture. He secures her academic work with the same chilling finality used to close a heavily armed operational briefcase. The subject desperately seeks a rupture in the escalating tension, hoping for a comedic resolution to a deeply traumatic reality. When the environment fails to provide a psychological exit, she resorts to frantic bargaining. She constructs an elaborate, mundane narrative about employers and mistaken deliveries, honestly, a pathetic attempt desperately trying to anchor herself to the normal world she is rapidly slipping away from. She attempts to project an artificial toughness, utilizing the learned defense mechanisms of an independent urban professional to mask her profound internal terror. In a final, pitiful bid for self-preservation, she offers to completely erase herself from his narrative, negotiating an invisible retreat down a secondary service stairwell. As we continue this behavioral review, observe the captor's chilling patience. He allows her to exhaust her frantic verbalizations without interruption, exhibiting the clinical detachment of an adult, humoring a deeply confused child. Once her futile bargaining concludes, his gaze locks onto her face. He issues a single, inescapable directive. She attempts to apply rational logic to a highly irrational power dynamic, arguing that the secondary predator has no intelligence on him. Giorgio systematically dismantles her naive worldview, coldly laying out the inevitable timeline. In 2 hours he will have a name, and in 4, her entire purpose. The psychological web is now actively tightening around her fragile consciousness, cutting off all emotional escape routes. The narcissistic sociopath expertly accelerates her cognitive dissonance. He outlines a precise threat matrix. In 6 hours they will sell her information, and in 8 she will be disposed of entirely, unless she accepts his dominant protection. It is the fundamental mechanism of Stockholm Syndrome, the captor positioning himself as the singular savior against a peril he inherently represents. When she weakly protests that she can ensure her own survival, the statement rings devastatingly hollow in his dominant reality. He observes her not with expected contempt, but with a deeply unsettling clinical recognition. He is diagnosing her psychological fragility in real time, mapping the exact coordinates of her impending submission and eventual total compliance. We arrive at the crucial moment of the traumatic shift. He looks at her as if referencing an entire archive of broken resilience, knowing precisely the mathematical decay rate of a victim's defiance. He reminds her of her initial, frantic transgression, dropping his vocal register to finalize the psychological cage. Now, he dictates her spatial reality. This is where the terrifying pathology of Stockholm Syndrome truly takes root in the subject. Beneath the thick layers of biological terror and cognitive rationalization, a microscopic fracture occurs in her psyche. She registers a deeply inappropriate, involuntary physiological thrill at her absolute subjugation. She resents this internal betrayal, yet as he calmly summons his enforcer, her psychological capture is already absolute. Let us examine the subject, Zoe, in the precise moment her autonomy is severed. The capo, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, orchestrates her extraction without raising his voice. He orders a fabricated story of illness. Zoe attempts to protest, but trauma parally. "Where?" the subject asked. "Let us examine this moment together, you and I." Her voice was a shamed whisper from a woman whose pride had been dismantled. She entered the vehicle because the preceding 5 seconds had been orchestrated by a megalomaniac narcissist. Giorgio sat beside her, checking his expensive watch with the chilling calm of a predator. He casually mentioned a destination where Bastien Lefra could not reach them. It took the subject an entire city block to process the anomaly, another block to accept the terror of it. She turned to him, her mouth bone dry. During the 18-minute extraction, she had never uttered the surname Lefra. Giorgio already knew. The simple life lesson here is that silence rarely protects us from those who listen in the dark. Giorgio rested his hand on his thigh, his profile turned toward the Paris streets with the entitlement of a man accustomed to owning whatever he surveys. The subject did not ask further questions. This is a fascinating regression. The old instinct of a 15-year-old girl who learned to hide her inquiries in a notebook surfaced to protect her. "Keep this, Zoe," her internal monologue urged. "Store the trauma for later." The vehicle turned onto Avenue Montaigne, descending into an underground facility. Vincenzo stepped out and opened her door. It was a gesture dressed as courtesy, but clinically it was a command of obedience. She stepped out, following her captors into a private elevator that ascended relentlessly to the penthouse. The isolation phase of containment had begun. The moment the doors parted, the vast apartment swallowed her whole. The acoustics were designed for isolation, the kind of silence where a scream simply dissolves into the expensive walls. She immediately recognized the architecture of her new reality. This was not protection. It was narcissistic containment. Giorgio discarded his coat with unnerving domestic ease, claiming the space. He assigned her a bedroom and instructed her to ask Vincenzo for necessities. But if she needed to leave, she had to ask Giorgio. When she tested the boundary, asking what would happen if she refused to ask, he did not show anger. Anger is a human emotion. Instead, he displayed the terrifying patience of a warden. He simply stated he would find out anyway, and the consequences would be severe. The subject swallowed dryly and retreated to her assigned quarters. She sat on the oversized bed and stared at the ceiling for an unquantifiable stretch of time. Note her emotional regulation here. She refused to cry. In extreme stress environments, weeping is a vulnerability reserved only for secured perimeters, and she had no locked doors to call her own. Sleep was biologically impossible. Her nervous system was locked in severe hypervigilance. She spent that first night mapping the acoustic footprint of her enclosure. She timed the heavy, deliberate footsteps of Vincenzo patrolling the corridor every 40 minutes. By 2 a.m, she documented a distant door closing and a muffled Italian conversation. Her mind was frantically building a defensive schematic. By the second morning, we see the classic early stages of traumatic bonding. She discovered fresh coffee, imported butter, and a note left on the kitchen counter. It read, "Back tonight. Do not open the door for anyone." The handwriting was disciplined and beautiful, masking the pathology of the man who penned it. She hid the paper in her pocket. Why? Because to a fractured mind, that note was undeniable proof that she still existed. It is a harsh truth we all must face eventually. Sometimes, we cling to the very hands that chain us just to feel the warmth of another human being. That night, she tested her perimeter. She opened the front door a mere 3 centimeters, only to find Vincenzo sitting there, calmly reading an Italian newspaper, with his glasses resting on his nose. Vincenzo raised his eyes from the paper. He did not speak a single word, because psychological dominance rarely requires volume. His silent gaze communicated the exact parameters of the unlocked door. She was free to walk out, but he would follow, and Giorgio would be informed. Defeated by the clinical efficiency of her captors, she closed the door and retreated to her room. She retrieved a small notebook from her bag. This was the same notebook, once used for harmless art restorations and addresses. Now it became a ledger of survival. She began to meticulously log patrol times, corridor dimensions, and camera blind spots. She was not planning a daring escape. The true tragedy of a captive mind is that she was simply trying to figure out how to survive inside the cage. On the 3rd day of her confinement, the subject received a psychological baseline test disguised as a gift. He brought 2 high-end shopping bags. You and I must look closely at this moment. He did not say to put the clothes on. A common abuser relies on direct commands, but a megalomaniac narcissist, like Vittorio, operates on a deeper level of control. He simply stated her clothes would not last the week, neutralizing her autonomy while appearing perfectly reasonable. Luca, already showing early adaptations of Stockholm Syndrome, found herself cataloging his physical traits, studying his dark expression, the way she used to analyze rare books. The lesson here is vital. True control rarely looks like a cage when it first arrives. It usually looks like a beautifully wrapped safety net. When asked about her captivity, Vittorio replied it would end only when he decided. It was not a threat, but a clinical redefinition of reality. She opened the bags, discovering only practical, black garments designed for silent movement. The psychological message was chillingly clear. She was not there to be an ornament. She was there to survive. This phase takes place in a sprawling penthouse on Avenue A Montaigne. Within 3 days, the isolation was taking its toll, forcing her to memorize the path of sunlight across the rug. The empty vastness was suffocating. The life lesson here is undeniable. Luxury, when entirely stripped of personal freedom, is simply a gilded holding cell, designed to slowly crush the human spirit. We see the victim's hypervigilance manifesting clearly here. The ceilings were far too high for her voice to carry, and the massive windows offered a mocking view of the outside world. Even the library felt sterile, the leather sofa reeking of chemical cleaners. She felt like a problem placed in cold storage. Yet, The human mind is remarkably resilient, always seeking order in chaos. She began timing the perimeter patrols. Vincenzo, the enforcer, swept the corridor in absolute silence every 40 minutes, while a younger guard held the reception desk. She documented these exact intervals in a tiny notebook hidden in a drawer. The lesson in her behavior is profound. When stripped of all external power, the human brain will meticulously gather data, turning quiet observation into an essential psychological survival mechanism. In her clinical file, she claimed she was not waiting for rescue, but actively calculating. She called Madame Aureli, her employer and closest maternal figure, projecting a raspy cough to sell a story of severe illness. A heavy silence hung on the line. Madame Aureli, a shrewd French woman with a measured voice, knew immediately this narrative was completely fabricated. She dryly advised Luca to let her know when this mysterious illness stopped preferring 5-star hotel lobbies. She wisely did not push for the truth. The life lesson embedded in this interaction is deeply sobering. We often believe our careful lies will protect the people we care about. But in reality, those well-intentioned lies only serve to build the very walls that keep us isolated, trapped, and entirely alone. Aureli used silence not as an interrogation tactic, but as a profound display of care. She simply told her to drink water and return in one piece. Luca ended the call quickly, terrified her wavering voice would betray her emotional state. That afternoon, she exhibited a classic psychological coping mechanism. Denying the housekeeper access, she washed her only blouse in the marble sink, draping the dripping fabric over the rack. This was a desperate assertion of boundary control from a woman who could no longer trust her environment. It was an inherited trauma response, mirroring her own mother's obsessive habits. The vital lesson here is clear. When people lose control over the major aspects of their lives, they fiercely guard the smallest, most insignificant daily routines just to maintain their sanity. Her behavioral baseline was tested again when he arrived unannounced. Luca sat barefoot on the rug, feigning interest in a book to mask her severe anxiety. She tracked the auditory cues as Vincenzo held the perimeter, and Vittorio breached her personal space. He carried a small box tied with a dark ribbon. His suit was missing its tie, his sleeve rolled up, projecting the exhaustion of a man returning from an act of unseen violence. He offered a simple good evening. In a textbook display of defensive defiance, she sarcastically addressed him by his Mafia title. He paused, amused by her resistance, and ordered her to open the box. The lesson here is that sarcasm is merely a shield for the terrified. When we feel utterly powerless, we use sharp words to pretend we are still holding a weapon. Let's open the file on Vittorio and his captive, Luca, and unpack this together. Luca asked if his gift was an order. Vittorio called it a request, his deep voice carrying a command that bypassed her conscious defenses. Inside the butcher paper was a rare edition of Les Fleurs du Mal by Baudelaire. Luca had casually mentioned this exact book days earlier to a hotel manager. Vittorio hadn't just listened, he catalogued her desires. When she looked up, Vittorio was watching her, not with romantic affection, but with the cold, assessing stare of a predator watching a snare pull tight. It is a classic tactic of the megalomaniac narcissist. They weaponize your own desires against you. The lesson here is simple: when someone gives you exactly what you want, always ask what it costs. In my clinical experience, victims often attempt to assert control when they feel it slipping. Luca tried this by equating him to the calculating collectors she knew at the Bellegarde Gallery. She challenged him, asking if he bought forgiveness, with rare books from every woman, or just the ones who kissed strangers in elevators. A megalomaniac like Vittorio thrives on this resistance. He allowed himself the ghost of a smile, a tiny micro-expression of amusement. When Luca lifted her chin, and stated she wouldn't accept gifts from the man dictating where she slept, she thought she was setting a boundary. Instead, she was playing his game. He leaned forward, trapping her in his space. Life teaches us early on. False bravery in front of a predator only seasons the meat. Vittorio pointed out her physical contradiction. She declined the gift verbally, yet clutched the book tightly to her chest, as if guarding a child. Luca tried to rationalize her grip, whispering that it was literature, not a bribe. The narcissist will always let the victim keep their illusions if it serves the trap. He ordered her to wear black for a working dinner. When she questioned him, he didn't bark an order. He simply looked her over, calculating the exact dosage of truth required to ensure compliance. He mentioned the Marchetti family and an alliance. A rival had seen her face. He was feeding her a narrative of shared danger. We must remember this fundamental truth. Shared trauma, even manufactured trauma, bonds us faster than joy ever could. The manipulation deepened as Vittorio assigned her a role in his survival. He told Luca that the streets were watching, and she needed to appear as his property to keep them safe. She accused him of using her as mere scenery. He corrected her, calling her a shield, a word deliberately chosen to make her feel essential, yet entirely disposable. Luca swallowed her pride and put on the black dress he had provided, clinging to her crooked glasses as a pathetic symbol of retained autonomy. When she returned, was facing the city. Men of his psychological profile rarely occupy space with loud bravado. They are black holes, pulling all the oxygen into their orbit. It is a harsh lesson, but true. The quietest danger in the room is always the one you should fear the most. He occupied the silence with the heavy stillness of a man who survived a lifetime of underestimation. When Luca announced she was ready, Vittorio deliberately paused, making her wait a fraction of a second for his validation. It is a textbook conditioning method. The transport was an armored car, delivering them to a sterile, heavily guarded restaurant. The streets had been emptied with the kind of capital only organized crime can mobilize. Inside, the Marchetti matriarch awaited them, adorned in antique rings and old money. Luca was being placed onto a chessboard she could not comprehend. If there is a life lesson to draw from my years analyzing these cases, it is this. When you step into someone else's carefully constructed world, you are no longer a person. You are a pawn. The Marchetti matriarch subjected Luca to an immediate stress test, switching languages to assert dominance. Luca held her gaze, employing a firm handshake to project competence. This is where Stockholm Syndrome begins to root the victim, seeks to make their captor proud. Down the table sat Tommaso, the consigliere, a man whose thin eyebrows and watchful eyes screamed hypervigilance. Vittorio had briefed her on him, reinforcing an us versus them dynamic. Tommaso deployed theatrical courtesy, asking for Luca's last name. He feigned deafness, rolling the syllables of Whitcomb around his mouth like a bitter wine. People often mistake manners for kindness, but in the criminal mind, politeness is purely an investigative tool. Tommaso played the frail old man, asking her to repeat her name. Look closely at how Luca reacts here. She instinctively checks Vittorio's posture for a cue. She sees his hand tense near his wine glass and mirrors his tension. She is aligning her survival with his approval. Luca gently repeated her name, treating the dangerous man like a polite child. The matriarch broke the tension with a soundless laugh, declaring her approval of the girl. Then came the pivot. She asked about Luca's work with antique manuscripts and a specific Venetian restoration. Despite her terror, Luca smiled, a genuine reaction to familiar territory. It is a tragic human flaw. We are so starved to be seen and understood that we will happily bond with the very monsters preparing to devour us. Let's examine how the victim finds comfort in her competence. Luca used a cloth napkin to demonstrate intricate paper margins and stitching techniques. For 15 minutes, she held the matriarch's absolute attention, discussing copper pigments and European paper variations. But she was oblivious to the psychological undercurrents. Beside her, Vittorio had stopped eating entirely. His gaze was fixed on her, calculating her sudden utility. When Luca finally snapped out of her hyper-focused state, she realized the matriarch had temporarily forgotten the brutal purpose of the meeting. Meanwhile, Tommaso was quietly taking notes. In my line of work, you learn a vital lesson. The moment you feel most comfortable in a predator's den is the exact moment they figure out how to use you. Luca's subconscious was screaming at her, logging details her conscious mind refused to accept. She realized she had never once mentioned her specific university or archive work to anyone in that room. Yet when the matriarch brought it up, Vittorio showed zero surprise. His facial muscles did not register discovery. They registered the confirmation of intelligence he had already gathered. The megalomaniac narcissist leaves nothing to chance. They own your history before you even share it. During the tense ride back, the silence stretched agonizingly until Vittorio offered a crumb of validation, telling her she did well. He denied she was mere scenery. The hardest lesson we face is realizing that the people who protect us from the wolves are often just wolves wearing a different suit. Physical proximity is the final stage of the Stockholm bonding process. In the armored car, Vittorio allowed his finger to brush hers. Luca immediately rationalized it as an accident, willfully blinding herself to his deliberate boundary testing. When they returned to the penthouse, Vittorio escorted her to her bedroom door. He reached out, stopping just a fraction of an inch from her glasses, letting the electrical charge of near-touch flood her nervous system. Then he withdrew, leaving her starved for contact. She leaned against the closed door, breathless, realizing she wanted this dangerous man to step inside. The lesson here is brutal but necessary. The darkest prisons are not built with iron bars. They are built with our own desperate, unacknowledged desires for connection. It was her own desire that terrified Luca more than the violence of the syndicate. A full week bled away inside that gilded cage. By Sunday, the Parisian light took on a soft, deceptive warmth. Vittorio appeared on the balcony, stripped of his corporate armor. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, projecting a carefully curated vulnerability. He positioned himself near her, close enough to invite intimacy, far enough to maintain deniability. This is the push-pull dynamic of trauma bonding. The captor becomes the sole source of peace in the chaotic world they created. We must always remember that the monsters of this world do not always arrive with bared teeth. Sometimes they arrive with rolled-up sleeves, leaning on a balcony, waiting for you to walk into their open jaws. Notice how the interrogator extracts information by planting a false premise. Vittorio casually asked about her mother, dropping the word Philadelphia. Luca froze. She could not remember telling him her origin. Cognitive dissonance kicked in. She convinced herself she must have let it slip, rather than accept the terrifying reality that he had investigated her entire life. Then she surrendered her grief to him. She confessed her father died in a crash when she was 15, and her mother followed 2 years later, effectively dying of a broken heart. By handing him her deepest wounds, Luca was solidifying her psychological capture. It is a profound, if tragic, lesson of the human condition. In our desperate search for safety, we often hand our sharpest knives to our own executioners. Let's pause and look at his technique here, because it is a masterclass in manipulation. Vittorio didn't interrupt her pain. He employed clinical, active silence, a psychiatric tool used to make the subject fill the void with their darkest secrets. He offered no cheap condolences, forcing her to keep talking. Luca told him about her mother's unrealized dream of the Amalfi Coast, about the old photographs, and the white chapel perched over the sea in Ravello. By silently absorbing her tragedy, Vittorio positioned himself as the sole container for her grief. The megalomaniac narcissist does not need to speak to control you. They just need to listen. The fundamental lesson is this: true empathy feels like a shared burden, while weaponized silence merely studies your wounds to see how deep they go. Today, you and I are going to unpack this story together. Let us examine the subject, Zoe, as she observes the man controlling her fate. You think his world is the size of a matchbox until you step inside. It is beautiful, clinically speaking. She turned to Giorgio. The line of his jaw held a tension defying their casual exchange. It was not the tension of longing or fond memories of a father. It was the physical manifestation of a megalomaniac narcissist carrying an unseen empire. In a micro expression of calculated warmth, He dropped his shoulders, smiled sideways, and reverted to a charming facade. "Drink your tea," he instructed. She complied. He lingered on the balcony. Through the glass, the Paris sky burning pink, his posture revealed a man wound tight. The patient initially misdiagnosed his tension as mere fatigue. She lacked the psychological framework for what was truly unfolding. Night descended. She dined in isolation while he locked himself away with Vincenzo, a classic isolation tactic. She retired early, suppressing any conscious memory of her former abuser, Bastian. Yet trauma always surfaces. She woke up screaming. The nightmare was a recurring loop of Bastian at her Philadelphia apartment, wielding a spare key, calmly demanding she come home. She jolted upright, hands clutching her chest, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Before a second scream could escape, the bedroom door cracked open. His voice drifted from the corridor. Just his voice and a shadow, anchoring her back to a terrifying reality. "Company or silence?" he asked in a low tone. "You choose. Stick with me here, because this is where the behavioral control mechanisms truly lock into place." By offering her the illusion of choice, the narcissist establishes a foundation of perceived safety. She swallowed dryly. She understood he had decided not to breach that threshold without explicit consent. "Silence," she whispered. The door returned to its closed, unlocked state. She lay there, insomnia gripping her mind. Hours later, she crept across the room barefoot and pressed her ear to the wood. He was still there. She heard the steady, rhythmic breathing of a man who had chosen to stand guard without demanding a reward. She returned to bed, clutching her pillow, slowly succumbing to Stockholm Syndrome. Morning illuminated the clinical reality of her environment. Opening the door, she nearly stepped on a glass of water. Beside it sat a white handkerchief, folded neatly in three. It bore no embroidery or initial. It was merely the physical evidence of an apex predator, anticipating her psychological distress. She stood paralyzed with the glass for a full minute. A profound, irrational pressure built behind her eyes. She forced the emotion down, employing cognitive dissonance. She told herself aloud that men of his profile did not leave water out of fondness. They did it out of a tactical duty to protect their assets. She repeated the rationalization 3 times to anchor herself. She did not believe even the first iteration, a clear sign the trauma bond was deepening. By afternoon, the dynamic shifted to the library, where he was replacing a coffee-stained shirt. Assuming the room was empty, she entered unannounced and stared directly at the scar on his left shoulder. From a forensic perspective, it was a broad, jagged mark. Not a clean surgical incision, but a brutal bullet wound stitched together hastily in an off-the-grid environment. He turned to retrieve the fresh garment with a chilling calmness. He was fully aware of her gaze. She apologized from the doorway. He dismissed it, securing 3 buttons with the meticulous precision of a highly organized individual. "What was it?" she asked, before her impulse control could engage. "The scar." "Another life," he replied, compartmentalizing his violent history with sociopathic ease. He executed a calculated, fractional pause that she had already learned to recognize. He studied her over the rims of his reading glasses, which hung from a black cord. She felt a fleeting, inappropriate amusement at their shared need for crooked eyewear. "Just that," he repeated, dropping his vocal register. She refused to retreat. She advanced toward the shelf, recognizing that lingering in the doorway equated to submission. She had already surrendered to too much autonomy in that penthouse. "I am returning to work," she stated. "Madame Aurielli requires my skills for an urgent manuscript commission." "You will go with Vincenzo," he countered. She agreed, asserting she could restore texts without security. "I know," his voice dropped further. "But you are not leaving without him." She stood a mere half-meter away, trapped between his imposing physical frame and the towering English literary shelves. His presence radiated a dangerous density. "Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we?" He performed a systematic visual sweep, evaluating her glasses, then her mouth, and finally locking onto her eyes. "Very well," she whispered, accepting the terms with Vincenzo. Neither subject moved a muscle. His respiration grew audible, carrying a distinct olfactory signature of bergamot, aged paper, and expensive wood. Slowly, his right hand ascended, suspending in the negative space between them. He moved his thumb in a deliberate, sweeping motion through the empty air, tracing the exact contour of her jawline without making physical contact. She tilted her face upward, a somatic surrender rather than a conscious choice. He closed the distance, pressing his forehead against hers for 3 agonizingly slow seconds. His breath fractured against her upper lip. It was an excruciatingly long interval in a week defined by such microscopic escalations. His hand anchored upon her waist over the fabric, offering support rather than restriction. Her own breathing destabilized, mimicking the physiological response of extreme exertion. He closed his eyes and whispered an apology in Italian, so faintly she only deciphered the word perdona. Then he executed a calculated retreat, a fractional step back, reinstating the boundary. "Vincenzo will take you Wednesday," he commanded softly. 7 in the morning. She evacuated the library before her autonomic nervous system completely short-circuited. Marching down the corridor, she sealed herself inside the bedroom, applying excessive force to the door. Pressing her forehead against the barrier, she deployed a harsh internal monologue to combat her own neurological betrayal. "He does not desire you," she recited. "He is merely protecting an asset. It is pure tactical strategy. Apex predators do not truly see women like you." She chanted this mantra 3 times, managing to believe only a fraction of the final attempt. Then, the auditory hallucination resolved into reality. A low, rhythmic sound bled through the wood. It was his respiration. He was standing directly outside, leaning against her only line of defense. She possessed absolute certainty without requiring visual confirmation. The brass doorknob vibrated microscopically, twice, under the heavy pressure of his thumb, yet it never turned. He maintained this silent siege for an unquantifiable duration. Finally, the tension snapped, and the heavy cadence of his footsteps receded down the hall. She lacked the psychological fortitude to open the door and verify his departure. Wednesday materialized beneath a pale, overcast sky. 48 hours had evaporated since the library incident. For 2 days, they had navigated the corridors like 2 subjects acutely aware of a near collision, mutually opting for silence. She had been awake since before dawn, perched on the mattress, with her crooked glasses and open notebook. "You and I are going to look at this together and decide what her actions really mean." The patient exhibited severe hypervigilance, calculating the intervals between security patrols 3 consecutive times. She obsessively transcribed her emergency exit strategy into microscopic print, fearing her previous draft resembled the erratic scrawl of a deteriorating mind. Madame Aurielli had telephoned exactly at 8 o'clock. The older woman possessed the brittle vocal tone of the chronically sleep-deprived, demanding assistance before noon to appraise a French psalter for a Lisbon collector. "For the love you have for books," she had pleaded. The patient disconnected the line. It was not merely for the texts, but for the dangerous emotional attachment she was forming. He infiltrated the living space, with his overcoat unfastened, his hair still holding the moisture of a recent shower. She caught his reflection in the glass before turning to face him. In that singular fraction of a second, the psychological grip of the megalomaniac narcissist wiped her memory of the antique texts and her own identity. He carried an atmospheric density that suffocated a room before he even crossed its threshold. "You are not going to like my next request," she preempted. "Probably not," he noted dryly. She detailed the urgent requirement for the Lisbon collector. He ceased his movement, anchoring his hands in his pockets, and stared out at the morning rain. She suspended her breathing. His silence was never empty. It was heavily calculated. Vincenzo on the outside, he finally dictated, employing his Sicilian trait of measuring every variable before executing a decision. "The vehicle remains at the curb. You will avoid the service exit. You will return before dusk." "I am not a child," she protested. "You are my responsibility," he countered, his gaze shifting to a cold blend of gray and cobalt. Survival sometimes means finding a cage that looks like a sanctuary. She shrugged, attempting to mask her realization of her own captivity, and gathered her materials. She departed before he could utter a phrase that might trigger a total collapse of her resolve. The atelier smelled of binding glue, decaying paper, and cold bergamot tea. She inhaled it like a desperate survivor, breathing in false freedom. Let us examine the subject's initial psychological environment. Outside the shop, Vincenzo stood guard. We see the classic hypervigilance of organized crime syndicates. He parked the vehicle tactically, hood facing the exit, mirrors adjusted to capture the entire street, functioning as an extension of his own paranoia. The subject noticed his hushed phone calls in Italian, and more importantly, a second, stationary black vehicle lurking in the alley. The conscious mind often represses these predatory signals to maintain a fragile sense of safety. The lesson here is quite simple. When your instinct registers a hidden threat, you must listen to it, because denial is simply the first stage of becoming a victim. The subject actively engaged in cognitive dissonance. She rationalized the predatory black car as a mere Parisian coincidence, choosing instead to focus on the mundane reality of the bookshop. Her employer, Arelli, casually mentioned a persistent flu, grounding the scene in deceptive normalcy. The subject retreated into her specialized task, evaluating a Portuguese manuscript. By meticulously noting the spine's decay and comparing the ink, she used repetitive labor as a psychological anchor. Her hands moved autonomously, shielding her conscious mind from the impending trauma. We must remember this fundamental human truth routine is the armor we wear when we unconsciously sense that our world is about to shatter. This brief window represented her first psychological baseline since the traumatic incident in the elevator. O'Reilly placed a cup of tea on the desk, observing the sentinel outside with a detached, clinical eye, noting his expensive footwear. The subject's agreement was an attempt to normalize the abnormality of a mafia bodyguard at a bookstore. As the Parisian sun retreated, casting a deceptive honey-colored glow over the ancient parchments, the illusion of safety collapsed. A sharp click of the latch preceded Vincenzo's voice, dropping an octave into pure survival mode, ordering her back inside. You and I can see how quickly the mind's constructed sanctuary can shatter. Peace is often just a temporary pause between crises. The subject committed the fatal error of looking, exposing her psyche to the raw violence of the environment. 3 assailants approached, one concealing a weapon, their getaway vehicle idling with its trunk open like a waiting grave. Clinically speaking, the autonomic nervous system usually triggers a freeze response in such extreme terror. Yet, she broke the mold. She did not freeze, screaming for O'Reilly to barricade the rear. The subject weaponized her environment, throwing her entire body weight against a massive oak catalog shelf. 20 years of heavy, leather-bound archives plummeted toward the aggressors. It teaches us a vital psychological principle. Sometimes, the only way to survive a monster is to become a force of nature yourself. The collapsing timber and flying parchment created a chaotic sensory overload. Glass shattered, accompanied by Vincenzo's untranslated Italian commands. Then came the physical intrusion. Large, aggressive hands grasped her ribs, her wrists, violently twisting her hair. In a fascinating display of primitive survival mechanics, the subject regressed to our most fundamental animal defense. She bit down on the assailant's wrist. She channeled the unprocessed grief of burying her father at 15, and the latent rage of escaping a controlling partner at 22. She bit until the metallic taste of his blood flooded her mouth, forcing a roar from her attacker. In life, we learn that true boundaries are not politely requested. They are fiercely defended. The physical retaliation succeeded. The assailant released his grip, sending the subject crashing onto the unforgiving Parisian stone, tearing her flesh and scattering her glasses into a blurred reality. Through this distorted visual field, she witnessed the terrifying efficiency of organized violence. Vincenzo neutralized the first target with 2 clean movements. Then, the megalomaniacal narcissist arrived. Giorgio's vehicle tore down the street against traffic, bending the city's rules to his sheer will. He did not run. He marched with the dark, inevitable gravity of an apex predator, his collar open, holding an unidentified object of harm. We must recognize that power does not need to rush. True authority always arrives exactly when it intends to. The subject observed the absolute dominance of the syndicate leader. Giorgio intercepted the fleeing attacker effortlessly. Without theatricality, he inflicted a calculated, structural break to the man's arm, a sickening snap echoing in the alleyway. Giorgio knelt, his voice devoid of empathy, delivering a message in flawless French for a rival named Lefra. He commanded the bleeding victim to carry a final warning, ensuring the psychological terror would spread like a virus. The man obeyed, trembling. Nearby, the subject realized the other assailant lay motionless, 3 meters away, permanently silenced. The lesson here is chillingly profound for individuals with deep antisocial traits. Violence is not an emotional outburst. It is simply a method of communication. The aftermath was starkly devoid of hysteria, characterized entirely by surgical, sociopathic efficiency. The subject entered a state of somatic tremors, her body processing the extreme adrenaline dump without losing consciousness. Aureli embraced her amidst the ruined archives, offering the grounding sensory input of bergamot and aged leather. The older woman instructed her to breathe deeply, anchoring her back to reality. Meanwhile, Vincenzo and Giorgio exchanged rapid Italian. When Giorgio approached, he touched her swollen lip, his expression hardening into an impenetrable mask. You and I must realize that trauma bonds begin in these exact moments of false rescue. We mistake the absence of immediate harm for the presence of genuine love. Let us evaluate the older woman's psychological fortitude. Aureli, possessing the calloused hands of a lifelong artisan, assessed the subject with clinical detachment. She bypassed standard platitudes, avoiding inquiries about the subject's emotional state. Instead, she asked the only question relevant to survival: did you bite? Confirming the metallic taste of blood, the subject passed this silent, primitive test of resilience. Aureli then turned her focus to Giorgio. He stood 2 meters away, his sleeves stained, containing an ocean of rage beneath a chillingly calm exterior. They assessed each other in a silent clash of wills. Life teaches us that the quietest individuals often harbor the most formidable internal strength during moments of absolute chaos. Aureli displayed a remarkable immunity to the kingpin's aura of intimidation. With the precise, authoritative tone she used for appraising ancient manuscripts, she demanded accountability, asking if he had anticipated this bloodshed. His silence was an admission of guilt. Aureli ordered him to tend to the subject's wounds, issuing a threat that she possessed dangerous connections of her own. Giorgio's micro-expression revealed genuine uncertainty, proving that true power respects fearless boundaries. He simply commanded them to the vehicle. Later, inside his sterile, opulent penthouse, the subject's hands continued to shake uncontrollably. We must understand that the body remembers the terror, long after the Maitne has rationally declared the danger over. The subject experienced severe depersonalization, observing her own trembling hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Giorgio secured the perimeter, dismissing his enforcer. He approached her with a slow, calculated caution, treating her like a fragile, fractured object. In a display of manipulative vulnerability, he knelt before her. For the first time, the subject exhibited active physical revulsion, pressing her torso deep into the upholstery to escape his proximity. She verbalized her rejection, her voice stripped of its cultured refinement, bluntly stating that he was not a good man. When analyzing these toxic dynamics, it becomes clear that rejecting an abuser's display of false humility is the first crucial step toward reclaiming one's autonomy. She confronted his brutality directly, citing the sickening auditory reality of the shattered bone. She vehemently rejected the romanticization of his violence, revealing her own history of trauma. Having endured 10 years of night terrors caused by a previous abuser, She possessed a profound, agonizing fluency in the language of violence. The narcissistic subject did not retreat. He absorbed her accusations while remaining on his knees, weaponizing his submission. He spoke in a low, modulated tone, insisting he would remain on the floor until she granted him permission to rise. Let us examine this carefully. The abuser grants a temporary illusion of control to the victim, simply to deepen the psychological enmeshment and secure the trauma bond. The cognitive dissonance reached a critical peak within her mind. Her hands, which had fearlessly toppled a heavy bookcase and drawn blood from an attacker, now shook at the sight of a powerful man feigning submission. Her ingrained anger did not dissipate, but it warped, carving out a dangerous space for compliance. She issued a single command for him to stay. Giorgio remained anchored to the carpet, his bespoke clothing stained with the violent residue of his true nature. He carefully removed her damaged spectacles, establishing direct, unshielded eye contact before softly asking for permission to touch her. You and I must recognize this terrifying shift when the captor asks for consent. The victim almost always surrenders their remaining defenses. The subject provided consent without. Let us open the file on Zoe. We see her standing before Giorgio, a classic, megalomaniacal narcissist who kneels with another man's blood staining his sleeve. He offers an apology, a calculated manipulation to appear vulnerable. Zoe responds, her voice hollow and stripped of breath, stating she has witnessed violence at 14, 15, and 22. She notes that Bastian never struck her physically, relying instead on psychological torment. Yet, she admits to Giorgio that she had never seen a man wield violence on her behalf. This is the seed of trauma bonding. She speaks to the room, to him, to herself, describing how violence is always directed against the vulnerable. It is a violent lesson that fear dictates who leaves the hallway light burning. Zoe reaches out, pressing her fingers to his steady wrist, a clinical indicator of his unnatural calm. She rationalizes his aggression, telling herself this violence was enacted to protect her. This cognitive dissonance is a hallmark of Stockholm Syndrome, where the victim reframes the predator as a savior. Giorgio tells her she owes him nothing, a subtle tactic to deepen her compliance. She presses her forehead against his, abandoning her defenses as their breathing synchronizes. His hand grips the back of her neck, the measured touch of a man accustomed to dominating his environment. She focuses on the scent of fresh linen and bergamot, grounding herself in sensory illusions. The lesson here is grim. We often confuse the absence of immediate harm with the presence of true safety. Observe the spatial dynamics here. The penthouse feels suffocating to Zoe, reflecting the psychological enclosure tightening around her. Giorgio speaks first, exploiting her hesitation. He insists she must know his true identity, framing his confession as vulnerability. Remaining on his knees, he employs physical submission to mask his absolute control. He reveals his lineage in a low cadence, stating he has been the head of a Sicilian crime family since he was 28. He speaks of old blood and new blood, deliberately withholding deeper truths under the guise of protecting her fragile state. This is textbook narcissistic conditioning. By acknowledging her trembling, he positions himself as a merciful ruler rather than the source of her terror, securing her misplaced trust. You and I must analyze his next maneuver carefully. Giorgio mentions an alliance involving her, deliberately introducing a threat, while simultaneously positioning himself as her sole shield. He swears on his own scar that she is safe, a grand declaration designed to foster absolute dependency. When Zoe asks why he cares, she is searching for a genuine emotional connection. He replies with a joyless smirk, stating it is because she threw herself at him. To her compromised mind, this does not register as the possession tactic it truly is. Instead, she romanticizes it as a sacred vow, comparing it to an ancient oath spoken in an empty church. The lesson is clear. When a victim is starved for security, they will interpret a warden's cage as a protective embrace, driven by a subconscious need to appease her captor. Zoe extends her hand first. He meets her grip with slow, deliberate finality, sealing the psychological contract. In the dark, she cradles his face, feeling the rough stubble and the chill of the Paris air seeping through the balcony. She rests her forehead against his, completely shedding the healthy fear that had kept her alert for the past week. She whispers an accusation that he is lying about something, yet she accepts it. Giorgio simply closes his eyes, conceding nothing. Zoe observes the unfair beauty of his dark lashes, romanticizing his physical traits to excuse his nature. Her voice remains remarkably steady, a symptom of her complete dissociation from the imminent danger. She has embraced the illusion. By stating she does not want to know the truth, Zoe willingly participates in her own deception. This denial is a survival mechanism. Giorgio takes a deep, ragged breath, performing a rare display of emotional overwhelm to validate her choice. When he finally kisses her, it is not a spontaneous act of passion, but a highly calculated maneuver. It is slow and controlled, reflecting the narcissistic need to weigh every action for maximum impact. His hand returns to her neck, a grip of ownership disguised as affection. He strokes her cheek to test her boundaries, sed noma grabest, mapping the new psychological territory he has conquered. She grants him full permission. It is a vital reminder that manipulation is most effective when the subject believes they are the one surrendering control. Let us observe how isolation is finalized. Giorgio pulls back just a fraction, maintaining intense visual dominance without her glasses acting as a barrier. He issues a simple command to follow him, extending his hand. She takes it, allowing him to lead her down the very corridor she used to meticulously time in her notebook, a space she once sought to understand and control, now surrendered entirely to him. He uses his shoulder to switch off the hallway light, symbolically plunging her into his absolute domain as the door shuts. Time passes and the pale morning light of Paris creeps over the white sheets, painting a serene picture that belies the psychological capture that has just occurred. The tragedy of the human mind is how beautifully it can dress up a cage. Zoe awakens, processing the room with a stark, new perspective. The space is forever altered by his presence, his discarded shirt, her glasses folded with an obsessive, terrifying precision. Through the wall, she hears the rhythmic cadence of his Italian, a reminder of the violent empire he commands. Yet, she smiles. This is the profound paradox of the Stockholm reaction. She realizes the hallway light has remained off all night. For the first time in 10 years, her chronic hypervigilance has ceased. She did not wake at her usual hours of trauma-induced panic. By submitting to a greater predator, her nervous system falsely registers safety. It is a haunting psychological adaptation. The brain will happily forge peace with a monster if it guarantees a single quiet night. You and I must recognize the regression happening here. Zoe experiences a shift in her breathing, a somatic memory linked to the early loss of her father. This vulnerability makes her the perfect host for a narcissistic protector. She touches her own skin, grounding when the quiet reality of the Paris Sunday morning, marveling that she has survived against the odds. The illusion of normalcy is powerful. The door opens without a sound, a testament to Giorgio's predatory stealth. He enters holding coffee and a rare book, playing the role of the refined caretaker. Dressed in black trousers and a partially unbuttoned white shirt, damp from the shower, he presents a disarming, domestic image. He is expertly painting over his violence with layers of domestic tranquility. Giorgio pauses at the threshold, deploying a calculated gaze to make her feel chosen, a common tactic in the megalomaniac's playbook. He approaches and hands her the cup. Zoe takes it, realizing the coffee is prepared with frightening exactness, the precise ratio of milk she prefers at her local bakery. When she questions how he knew, his answer is chilling in its clinical observation. He tells her he watched her drink it 3 times, having memorized her habits by the second observation. To a healthy mind, this level of surveillance would be terrifying. To the bonded victim, it is interpreted as profound care. She smiles and drinks, cementing her complicity. He places the book on the bed in silence, The life lesson here is stark. Obsession often masquerades as devotion. The rare book rests between them, a material anchor for his unspoken apology, which she eagerly receives as the sweetest gift of her life. We must note how he seamlessly manages her reality. He informs her he has arranged her schedule, making commitments on her behalf. She blindly accepts this erosion of her autonomy. His tone darkens as he mentions Bastian. He states plainly that he has taken care of the threat, asserting his dominance over rival figures. He promises to resolve the Mafia dispute without using her as currency, portraying himself as a noble shield rather than the very danger surrounding her. Zoe replies that she believes him. Her psychological submission is complete. She is mistaking a violent dictator for a guardian angel. Giorgio commands her to rest, dictating the pace of their integration. Zoe attempts a fragile joke about avoiding marriage, seeking a momentary levity to dilute the intensity of her capture. The narcissist meets this with a calculated half-smile, matching her rhythm while maintaining the upper hand. He agrees to no marriage or children for now, offering her the illusion of boundaries. He claims he only makes small promises because those are the ones he can keep. This pseudo-humility is incredibly effective. Overwhelmed by this constructed safety, Zoe leans in to kiss his shoulder. It is an act of domestic familiarity, artificially accelerated by the intensity of trauma. What should take months of healthy trust building has been forged in 2 weeks of absolute fear and relief. He rests his chin on her head, breathing in her scent, establishing a physical monopoly. Zoe steps into the cold, sprawling marble of the penthouse kitchen, wearing his oversized dress shirt. This is a classic visual marker of assimilation. She is draped in his identity, having discarded her own garments. Giorgio follows, placing a heavy, possessive hand on her waist. The speed of this physical entitlement is a red flag, though Zoe interprets it as affection. Standing at the counter is Vincenzo, his enforcer, fully dressed in a dark suit, reading the morning paper. The stark contrast between Zoe's vulnerable, barefoot state and the cold, armor of Vincenzo highlights the absurdity of her situation. She has built a home inside a fortified military compound. Let's conclude this entry by observing the ecosystem of the predator. Vincenzo looks up, his facial muscles locked in a permanent display of stoic hostility. He addresses Giorgio formally as the Don, a chilling reminder of the hierarchy they inhabit. Giorgio responds in rapid Italian, adopting the casual tone of a man sparring with an old comrade. Zoe cannot translate the words, but she comfortably absorbs the rhythm. Vincenzo flips his newspaper, shooting Zoe a fraction of a smile before wishing her a good morning in French. He directs her to the breadbasket, normalizing her presence in their dangerous world. And Zoe laughs. It is a genuine, breathless sound. The assimilation is complete. She has found true joy among men who could end her life in an instant. Let us observe the subject in her temporary sanctuary. She sits at the counter, wearing the oversized shirt of her captor. This is a classic manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, wrapping herself in his identity to feel safe. Giorgio, a megalomaniac narcissist, leans nearby, projecting false domestic tranquility as sunlight warms the floor. In this deceptive moment, her cognitive dissonance shatters. She recalls a chilling detail from their first day in the elevator. Before she ever spoke of the man passing the door, Giorgio had casually stated the full name, Bastian Lev. He already had the target catalogued in his cold mind. It is a haunting truth we must realize. Our minds often suppress glaring red flags to protect a fragile heart from breaking. Notice the physiological response she exhibits here. She sets down her cup, staring at Giorgio's profile. He is expertly performing the role of the protector, his thumb tracing slow circles on her back. This is a calculated tactile manipulation designed to deepen her trauma bond. The burning realization of his prior knowledge sits heavy on her tongue for 2 excruciating seconds. But she swallows it. Why does she remain silent? Because she has finally tasted happiness. And for a traumatized victim, happiness is far more terrifying than fear. It represents something fragile left to lose. She locks the realization away in her mind. We often choose to embrace a comfortable, beautiful lie over a devastating truth. But the physical body never truly forgets the deception. She compartmentalizes the anomaly, filing it away in her mental ledger, right alongside emergency exits and guard routes. This is hypervigilance disguised as domestic bliss. Giorgio, possessing the hyper-attuned radar of a sociopath, senses the subtle shift in her baseline. He turns his head and asks if everything is all right. A clinical test of her loyalty. She lies, sealing the falsehood by kissing his shoulder. He rewards her compliance with a gentle kiss to her head. A flawless execution of operant conditioning as the sun rises over Paris. Before we proceed to the next phase of this case file, remember this vital lesson. True safety is never found in the arms of someone you have to constantly study just to survive the day. Let us open the second volume of this psychiatric profile. For a nominal fee to your own peace of mind, observe how quickly the trap springs. 3 weeks of manufactured peace were all it took for her to commit a profound psychological error. She believed the illusion. Giorgio brought her coffee and slept beside her, perfectly masking the blood and the debts between them. She genuinely believed she had been rescued. But megalomaniacs do not rescue people. They acquire them. She was merely the next pawn in his sophisticated chess game. The man who orchestrated her false sense of security was the very predator she should have fled from the start. The most dangerous cage in the world is always the one that is carefully designed to look exactly like a warm, inviting sanctuary. The final psychological fracture occurs when physical evidence finally aligns with her suppressed instinct. A photograph slips from the book he gave her. It captures her at 16, innocent and smiling at graduation. And there, lingering in the background across the street, is a younger Giorgio. The narcissist had been silently stalking his prize for years. The Italian inscription on the back is his ultimate pathological signature. The debt begins here, and you are going to pay me dearly. Her hands turn to ice. Her chest physically collapses under the weight of the betrayal. The Stockholm delusion entirely evaporates, leaving only clinical terror. You can never truly heal in the exact same environment that broke you, no matter how intoxicating the poison might taste.
The strongest lessons from Zoe Wickham's story is that running away from one danger does not always mean a person has reached true safety. Zoe enters the elevator because she is terrified of Bastien Lev, the ex-fiancé who once controlled, humiliated, and monitored her life. In that moment, Giorgio Castellaneta appears to be an unexpected rescue. His presence is powerful enough to make Bastien step back immediately, and for a few seconds, Zoe feels protected. However, the story quickly teaches that protection can be complicated when it comes from someone even more dangerous. Giorgio saves her Barnstorm, but he also decides where she will go, who will guard her, and when she can leave. Zoe realizes that she has exchanged a familiar cage for a more beautiful, more powerful one. This is an important educational message. Many people who expect controlling relationships may become more vulnerable to another form of control, especially when the new person appears stronger, kinder, or more capable of protecting them. Fear can make safety feel like love, but safety without freedom is still a prison. Zoe's journey reminds viewers to examine not only who protects them, but how that protection is offered. Does it come with respect, choice, and honesty? Or does it come with surveillance, decisions made without consent, and emotional dependence? Giorgio's world may shield her from Bastien, but it also pulls her into secrets she does not understand.
The lesson is clear. The true safety does not require surrendering your agency. A real rescue does not replace one controller with another.
It helps a person regain the power to choose their own life.